in the heart of Salt Lake City, where steeples rise against snow-capped mountains and family values are deeply embedded into daily life. Arthur Gary Bishop was seen as a product of Mormon perfection, born into a conservative and devout Latter-day Saints family in 1951. Arthur's early life was steeped in tradition, discipline, and reverence for authority. His father was a respected bishop in the local ward, and his mother, a homemaker, was known for her quiet grace and spiritual dedication. Arthur was the eldest of 3 children and was expected to be a role model. From a young age, he was placed on a path of righteousness, scripture readings before breakfast, church every Sunday, and evening prayers like clockwork. His grades in school were impressive, and he was often called exceptional by teachers and church leaders alike. By all outward appearances, he was destined for greatness. But under the surface, there were cracks. Even as a child, Arthur exhibited behaviors that were odd, yet easily dismissed. He hoarded small objects, became emotionally distant, and was caught once harming a neighbor's Catan incident his parents chalked up to childish curiosity. But to Arthur, it was something more. It was his first taste of power over something vulnerable, and he remembered the feeling. Despite these troubling tendencies, Arthur was praised relentlessly. The expectations placed upon him began to feel suffocating, and he learned to cope the only way he could by hiding his real self. He became a master of mimicry, echoing the virtues his community expected. Even as his inner thoughts grew darker, by 19 he had received his mission call to the Philippines, a prestigious honor for any young Mormon man. It was here that his personality fully splintered. In public, he was pious and charismatic, winning converts and praise from mission leaders. But privately, he began indulging in dark fantasies, disturbed by their growing intensity, yet helpless to stop them. Upon returning home, he enrolled at Brigham Young University, but the structure of academic life could not contain his growing inner chaos. He began stealing, lying, and isolating himself from friends. When he was caught embezzling over $10,000 from a church-run youth program, the church elders confronted him. Arthur, unemotional and blank-faced, accepted his excommunication with an eerie calm. His fall from grace devastated his family. His parents begged him to repent and rejoin the church, but Arthur had already made a decision. He would disappear, just physically, but spiritually, morally, and psychologically. He severed ties with his past life, moved to Nevada, and changed his name. The man who once led Sunday school was gone. In his place stood something far colder, more calculating. What followed was a descent that no one could have predicted. Arthur adopted new identities with ease. He studied psychology, read books on serial killers, and immersed himself in obscure religious texts, twisting scriptures into self-serving philosophies. He no longer saw himself as fallen, but as chosen. In his warped view, he had been cast out by a flawed church that couldn't see his true purpose. His destiny, he believed, was not to save souls, but to cleanse them. It was around this time he began writing what would later be called the Journals. Thousands of handwritten pages detailing his beliefs, his compulsions, and eventually, his plans. It started as a way to process his thoughts, but quickly turned into a disturbing manual of control and death. Each entry grew darker than the last. He wrote about purity, about discipline, and about the divine purpose of eliminating the corrupted innocence. Despite this descent, Arthur remained undetected. He maintained a clean appearance, volunteered occasionally at local shelters, and never stayed in one place too long. His charm, albeit stiff and rehearsed, disarmed suspicion. People remembered him as quiet but kind, or helpful, if a bit odd. No one could have imagined the horrors that were beginning to take form in his mind. By 1979, Arthur had settled, briefly back in Utah. Using the alias Roger Downs, he worked as a clerk at a church library by day and lived in a small, cluttered apartment by night. He surrounded himself with children's books, religious texts, and crime novels. He installed 2 deadbolts on his door, blacked out his windows, and kept a series of practice notebooks where he wrote and rewrote scenarios of abduction, murder, and concealment. His journals reflected not chaos but precision. Arthur wasn't a man in crisis. He was a man in preparation. The final transformation came one night in March of that year. He stood in front of a mirror, clean-shaven, dressed in his Sunday best. He recited a prayer, not to God, but to himself. "I am the instrument," he wrote that night. "I am the reckoning." The mask of faith was complete, and behind it lurked a predator. The spring of 1979 arrived in Provo, Utah, with its usual tranquility. Trees bloomed along the quiet streets, families attended church picnics, and children played freely in the parks. It was a town where neighbors knew each other by name, and doors were left unlocked without fear. But on April 13th, that peace was shattered when 5-year-old Brian Montgomery disappeared from a local playground, vanishing into thin air in the span of a few minutes. Brian had been playing just a few feet away from his mother while she chatted with other parents. He wore a bright red t-shirt, blue shorts, and light-up sneakers. The park was filled with children that day, laughing, shouting, chasing one another. When his mother turned her attention back to the sandbox, Brian was gone. Panic set in immediately. Parents spread out to search the area, calling his name, hoping he had simply wandered off. Within the hour, police were contacted. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, helicopters scanned the wooded areas, and canine units combed nearby trails. But there was nothing, no trace, no clues, no witnesses. It was as if Brian had evaporated. The community was devastated. Flyers covered telephone poles. Candlelight vigils were held. Local news ran non-stop coverage of the search. With Brian's smiling face and missing person details flashing across the screen, volunteers flooded in from nearby towns to help. For weeks, everyone looked, but no one found anything. It would be the beginning of a terrifying pattern. Behind the headlines and hope, Arthur Bishop was watching. He read every article, recorded every news segment, and clipped every flyer with Brian's photo. In his journals, he chronicled his first murder in chilling detail. The planning, the method, the aftermath, it was all carefully preserved, as if he were archiving a sacred event. The way he described it wasn't with guilt or regret, but with fascination and pride. According to his private writings, Arthur had been stalking playgrounds for weeks, searching for a child who fit a certain mold, young, trusting, and alone, even for a moment. When he saw Brian that day, he knew instantly he had found his first victim. He approached him casually, introducing himself as Brother Roger and complimenting Brian's sneakers. He offered him a ride to get ice cream. At that age, Brian didn't think twice. Witnesses later recalled seeing a brown station wagon slowly leaving the parking lot, but it was unremarkable at the time. Arthur's apartment had already been prepared. Blackout curtains covered the windows. Soundproofing had been installed. What occurred inside those walls over the next several hours was never revealed in full detail. But authorities would later describe the crime as ritualistic and methodical. Arthur saw it not as violence but as control. It was about asserting dominance, about becoming something more than a man, something like a god. When it was over, he washed the boy's body, wrapped him in a white sheet, and drove 3 hours into the Utah wilderness. He buried Brian near a remote canyon trail, marking the location on a map that he later sealed in a file titled Deliverance 1, back in town. Arthur resumed his life as if nothing had happened. He returned to work. He smiled at neighbors. He even attended a vigil for the missing boy. The secrecy thrilled him. The duality empowered him. The fact that he could take a life and be back in church the next morning without suspicion confirmed what he had always suspected, that he was smarter, colder, and more capable than the world around him. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was at a loss. There were no signs of forced entry, no physical evidence, and no witnesses. They looked into known offenders in the area, even questioned a few drifters, but nothing stuck. A reward fund was started. Psychics were consulted. But as the weeks dragged on and leads dried up, Brian Montgomery became just another cold case. For Arthur, this only reinforced his belief that he was invincible. But the murder did something else. To him too it awakened something that would not go back to sleep. In the weeks after Brian's disappearance, Arthur began having vivid dreams, not of guilt, but of reenactments. In his mind, he saw himself from above, powerful, unbound by law or morality. He called it the Ascension. His journals grew more elaborate. He mapped future abduction zones, analyzed the behaviors of children, and created timelines to prevent pattern detection. He devoured news about other missing persons cases, noting police tactics and where mistakes were made. He was learning, improving, evolving. 2 months after Brian's murder, Arthur relocated. He changed his hair, grew a mustache, and got a job at a storage warehouse in Ogden, under the name Gary Monroe. He chose a new hunting ground, a different neighborhood, but the same goal. By this point, he no longer saw these acts as crimes. They were rituals, cleansings, and he had convinced himself that the children he took were being spared from the corruption of the world. What Arthur couldn't have known was that while he felt increasingly empowered, the small details he left behind would one day come back to haunt him. But that reckoning was still years away. For now, he was just getting started, and the community of Provo, still mourning little Brian, had no idea that the man responsible had stood among them smiling, praying, and shaking their hands. Arthur Bishop didn't just hide in the shadows, he thrived in the light. After the murder of Brian Montgomery, he learned a crucial lesson. The best way to avoid suspicion was not to run, but to blend in, to become part of the very community. Searching for monsters, and then wear their trust like armor, in 1981. After nearly 2 years of drifting from town to town, under various aliases, Arthur returned to Salt Lake City. To anyone paying attention, he was just another mild man with a modest job and a quiet life. He went by the name Roger Downs, claiming to be a recent convert to the church, who was looking to rebuild his faith. His demeanor was calm, friendly, and disarming. No criminal record. No strange behavior. Just another face in the pews. Through connections in the Mormon community, Arthur managed to secure a volunteer position at a church-run youth center. It was here, under the guise of mentorship and charity, that Arthur resumed hunting. The youth center served as a haven for troubled or fatherless boys aged 6 to 12. They came for scripture lessons, homework help, and weekend outings. Arthur quickly became a favorite among the children. He brought treats, organized movie nights, and read them Bible stories with the gentle warmth of a caring uncle. Parents adored him. Staff trusted him. No one questioned why he often volunteered to drive the boys home alone. He was, once again, hiding in plain sight between the fall of 1981 and the spring of 1983. 4 more young boys would go missing each. Case eerily similar to Brian's. The first was 8-year-old Samuel Turner, who vanished after attending a church-sponsored camping trip in Logan. No one had seen him leave, and the boy's sleeping bag was still neatly folded. His disappearance sparked panic, but investigators found no signs of struggle and no witnesses who could recall anything suspicious. The second was 7-year-old Eli Ramirez, who disappeared while walking home from the youth center. The route was short and familiar. His older sister had left only minutes before him, assuming he would follow. He never arrived home. Weeks later, his backpack was found floating in a nearby canal, but Eli was never found. Arthur recorded everything in his journal, which by now had taken on the tone of a holy manuscript. He referred to each victim, not by name, but by assigned numbers, Deliverance 2, 3, 4, and so on. He documented their behaviors, what they said in their final moments, how long it took for them to trust him. He even ranked their purity based on how innocent or corrupt he perceived them to be. To the outside world, Arthur was a godsend. He attended church regularly, donated generously, and volunteered for every youth event. His calm presence and willingness to serve made him a beloved figure in the community. He knew how to make adults feel at ease and how to manipulate children into trusting him. He never raised his voice, never seemed nervous. If anything, he seemed too perfect. But cracks began to show. One of the youth center's part-time staffers, a college student named James Withers, began to feel uneasy. He noticed that Arthur often took boys aside for long one-on-one conversations and discouraged others from joining. He also realized that Arthur had been present at multiple events where boys later went missing. James voiced his concerns to the youth center's director, but was met with skepticism. "Arthur," the director asked, almost laughing, "he's the most trustworthy man we've got." Accusations without evidence were seen as malicious. James was warned to drop it or face removal from the program. He did. Meanwhile, Arthur was escalating. His rituals became more elaborate. He began collecting items from his victim's shoes, t-shirts, hand-drawn pictures. He stored them in a locked footlocker at the back of his closet, each labeled and cataloged. The trophies weren't just keepsakes. They were symbols of conquest, of control. Each child he murdered made him feel more powerful, more untouchable. He also began taping news broadcasts and collecting newspaper clippings about the investigations. His obsession wasn't just with the murders, but with the chaos they created. Watching families fall apart, seeing the police scramble for answers, hearing the community whisper and speculate it, was a second level of satisfaction for him. The community, for all its righteousness and order, never suspected him. In the spring of 1983, Arthur made what would prove to be a fatal mistake. He took 6-year-old Daniel Tate from the church parking lot one Sunday afternoon. But this time, there was a witnessy teenage girl named Erin, who had stayed late after choir practice. She saw Daniel getting into a brown station wagon with a man in a white shirt and dark slacks. She couldn't see the man's face clearly, but she remembered the license plate's first 3 letters. When police cross-checked vehicle registrations in the area, they found a partial match registered to a Roger Downs. Surveillance was set up near his apartment while a warrant was being prepared. What police would find inside his home would unravel one of the most horrifying secrets in Utah's criminal history. Arthur Bishop, once a shining example of faith and community, had been living among them all along, not as a man of God, but as a silent predator, calm, composed, and utterly remorseless. The disappearance of 6-year-old Daniel Tate on June 12, 1983, would finally shatter the illusion Arthur Bishop had so meticulously built. For 4 years, he had outwitted police, bypassed suspicion, and wormed his way deeper into the very institutions meant to protect children. But this time, he made a mistake. Daniel had been attending a Sunday afternoon children's program at the Salt Lake City Chapel. As families mingled in the parking lot and kids played near the church steps, Arthur stood nearby, watching, waiting. Daniel had wandered away from the group, trailing behind his older brother, who had briefly gone to fetch a book from inside. Arthur saw his chance. In less than a minute, Daniel was in the passenger seat of Arthur's brown station wagon, promised a trip to get candy. Arthur drove away calmly, blending into traffic, unnoticed by most except for one. Erin Coulter, a 17-year-old choir volunteer, had been gathering hymnals near the entrance. She looked up just in time to see Daniel getting into the vehicle. Something about it unsettled her. Maybe it was the way the man quickly avoided eye contact. Maybe it was the fact that Daniel didn't wave goodbye, as he usually did. Erin didn't know it yet, but her instinct and keen memory would be what brought an end to Arthur Bishop's reign of terror. Erin told her parents that night, and they reported the incident to the police. She remembered the vehicle clearly. brown 1973 station wagon with a dented left fender. The most vital detail: the partial license plate, RDN. It wasn't much, but in the hands of an experienced detective, it was a thread, and it would soon unravel everything. Detective Harold McMillan had been tracking the pattern of missing boys for over a year. He was convinced the cases were connected, but he had no evidence and faced constant resistance from both church leadership and city officials, reluctant to cause panic. When Aaron's report came in, he immediately cross-referenced local DMV records. There were 14 registered vehicles that fit the description and plate sequence. One name jumped out: Roger Downs. The address listed was a modest duplex near Liberty Park. McMillan ordered immediate surveillance. 2 plainclothes officers began monitoring the location. Arthur, now growing increasingly paranoid, noticed the same white sedan parked across the street for 2 nights in a row. He packed a bag, left through the back alley, and fled to Las Vegas, using a fake ID under the name James Hua Curtis. By the time police arrived with a search warrant, he was gone. But what they found inside would stun even the most hardened detectives. The apartment was small and tidy, but a bedroom closet was locked from the inside. When forced open, investigators discovered a footlocker that held the horrifying truth. Inside were labeled Ziploc bags containing boys' clothing, shoes, drawings, and hair. Each was marked with a date, a number, and a chilling label: Deliverance 1, Deliverance 2, and so on. In a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, officers uncovered Arthur's journals. Thousands of pages written in cramped, obsessive handwriting. They documented everything: his scouting process, the methods of abduction, psychological observations of his victims, and in some cases, details of their final moments. There were crude maps with X marks over wooded areas, riversides, and canyons. Several of these locations matched the last known areas where the missing boys had been seen. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a list. A single sheet of yellow legal paper on which Arthur had written 20 names, 5 of which matched known missing children, the rest unknown. Authorities feared the worst. Was this a hit list? A record of past kills? Or a plan for future victims? The media exploded with coverage. The Ruthless Mormon, as Arthur was now dubbed by headlines, had infiltrated the community under the guise of trust and holiness. The Mormon Church issued a public statement condemning the acts and expressing sorrow, but the damage had already been done. Parents across Utah were consumed with fear, their trust in religious institutions shaken to the core. A multi-state manhunt began immediately. Arthur's photo was plastered across news channels, post offices, and highways. But he had vanished, without a trace. It would be 5 days before he was found in a cheap motel room just off the Las Vegas Strip. He had shaved his head, changed clothes, and disposed of all personal identification. When U.S. Marshals broke through the door, they found him sitting calmly on the edge of the bed, reading from a Book of Mormon. He didn't resist. In fact, he smiled. In custody, Arthur was eerily cooperative. He confessed to 5 murders in vivid detail, identifying the boys by name and providing the exact locations of their burial sites. He spoke with a clinical, detached tone, as though discussing medical procedures. He showed no emotion, no remorse. "I was chosen," he said during one interview. "I was sent to cleanse the impure." When asked if there were more victims than the 5 he named, Arthur remained silent. "There are things," he said cryptically, "you'll never understand." News of the confession caused shockwaves. Families who had held on to hope for years now received the worst confirmation imaginable. Search teams were dispatched to the remote sites he identified. All 5 bodies were eventually recovered. Each location matched the coordinates Arthur had drawn in his journal. He had been exact to the foot. With physical evidence, written confessions, and forensic links, the case against Arthur Bishop was airtight. The justice system moved swiftly, but, even with his arrest, the sense of horror lingered. How had he gone unnoticed for so long? How had the church, the schools, and the justice system failed to connect the dots? And most terrifying of all, were there still more victims who would never be found? Arthur Gary Bishop's trial began in early 1984, less than a year after his arrest. It would become one of the most disturbing and closely watched legal proceedings in Utah's history. Courtrooms were packed with reporters, victims' families, and curious onlookers. What they witnessed was not a monster frothing with rage, or a man broken with regret, but something much colder. Arthur entered the courtroom in a pressed suit, clean-shaven and composed. He looked like a schoolteacher, not a serial killer. He sat calmly, showing little emotion as prosecutors described, in agonizing detail, the murders of 5 innocent boys. Each child's name was spoken aloud. Each life extinguished was brought back into the light, if only briefly, to demand justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic teams had matched fibers, hair, and fingerprints from Bishop's apartment to several victims. His journals introduced into evidence as Exhibit 14 became the most damning testimony of all. They were read aloud in court, page after page of chilling introspection. There were passages that described the sounds of his victims' last breaths, his prayers before each murder, and philosophical ramblings about innocence, control, and divine selection. He never denied any of it. Under cross-examination, Arthur remained eerily detached. When asked why he killed, he responded in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, "Because I felt compelled. Because I believed it was a calling." His lawyers attempted to argue mental illness, claiming he suffered from a severe dissociative disorder. But the state countered with psychiatric evaluations, showing Arthur was fully aware of his actions and understood right from wrong. His killings weren't the result of insanity. They were the result of a man who chose to act without empathy, without remorse, and with complete deliberation. As the trial wore on, the courtroom became a place of pain. Parents sobbed openly as they heard how their children were lured, manipulated, and killed. Jurors appeared visibly shaken. A few reporters refused to return after the first week. The horror wasn't just in the crimes, it was in the calmness of the man who had committed them. Bishop's sentencing was swift. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. He was found guilty on 5 counts of capital murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. But even in prison, Arthur wasn't finished. At Utah State Prison, he became a peculiar figure, neither feared nor respected, but studied. He spent his days reading theology, writing essays, and exchanging letters with criminologists and journalists. Some wrote to understand him. Others hoped to uncover more victims. He never confessed beyond the 5 murders for which he was convicted, but his writings suggested more. In a letter to a university professor, he wrote cryptically, "There are stories untold, graves untouched, but God knows where they are, and that's all that matters now." This led to renewed investigations into unsolved disappearances in surrounding states during the late 70s. While no direct links were ever proven, many believe Bishop's real victim count may be closer to a dozen or more. One of the most disturbing aspects of Arthur's imprisonment was his continued justification of his actions. He never once expressed genuine remorse. In a televised interview 2 years before his execution, he stated, "The boys I took were not meant for this world. I gave them something pure, something eternal. They don't suffer now, but I do. Every day." The contradiction in his words only deepened the mystery surrounding his mind. Was he delusional, or simply evil? Over time, Arthur became less vocal. The public moved on, but for the families, time had done little to dull the pain. Every birthday, every holiday, every empty seat at the dinner table was a reminder of what was taken. Some tried to forgive, others never could. In 1988, Arthur Bishop was executed by lethal injection. The execution took place at 12:07 a.m., with Only a few witnesses present, including the families of 2 victims. He declined the final meal. His last request was to hear a Mormon hymn played softly in the background. Just before the injection began, he whispered, "Forgive me, or don't." Then he closed his eyes. He was pronounced dead 11 minutes later. After his death, his journals and writings were sealed by court order. The victims' families requested that the material never be published, fearing it would glorify him or inspire copycats. Law enforcement agreed. To this day, much of what Bishop recorded remains locked away in an archive, inaccessible to the public. The case of Arthur Bishop left a permanent scar on Utah's psyche. It raised painful questions about blind faith, institutional trust, and the hidden dangers that can lurk within communities that value image over truth. For years, the Mormon Church conducted internal reviews, examining how someone like Arthur could have slipped through the cracks so easily. Some changes were made, but the damage had been done. The true horror of Arthur Bishop wasn't just the lives he took, it was the mask he wore. He was the volunteer, the mentor, the trusted friend. He wasn't a stranger hiding in the dark. He was sitting in the front pew,